First Sabbath series. Discover the stories. Explore the legacy. Be part of the conversation. Your hosts, Dana C. Edmond, Rebecca Jackson, and Jerson Pancorbo. This month, we will talk with pastors and historians of the church about the creation of the regional conferences. First Sabbath series, 80th anniversary of regional conferences. By the 1940s, racial tensions in the United States were at a high point, and the civil rights movement was beginning to gain traction. Within the SDA Church, African American members were increasingly frustrated with the persistent racial discrimination and segregation they experienced. During the General Conference session held in 1944 at the Stevens Hotel in Chicago, Illinois, the issue of racial segregation and the formation of regional conferences was formally addressed. After much discussion and debate, the delegates voted in favor of establishing regional conferences. This decision marked a significant shift in the church's organizational structure.
Good afternoon. I'm Elder Dana C. Edmond. I'm the Executive Director for the Office of Regional Conference Ministries, and this is First Sabbath. We're coming to you from two places. The first place is the Hilton Chicago, where, though it was called the Stevens Hotel then, 80 years ago, history was made. 80 years ago, in this room, the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists voted to authorize what we today know as regional conferences. Then they were called colored conferences. 80 years ago, history was made in this room. 80 years ago, the trajectory of the Adventist church was changed. For since the formation of regional conferences have grown 4 times faster than the rest of the church. We now have our own retirement program. We now have a 2-story, 32,000 square foot, $9 million headquarters in Huntsville that was dedicated debt-free. But all of that started in this room. Over the next 90 minutes to 2 hours, we want to tell the story of regional conferences. We want to tell it in 2 places. We want to tell it from here in Chicago, and then later on, Elder Pancorbo, Ms. Jackson, and I will be in Washington, D.C., where we tell the story of how a group of laymen working with some pastors influenced the vote that took place in this room. We want to tell you that story. This is First Sabbath. We are in the Stevens Hotel, which is now the Chicago Hilton. And 80 years ago, a very historic meeting took place. The General Conference met here in the spring meeting, April 8 through 11, 1944. And there, the vote was taken by the delegates to authorize what we today call regional conferences. Back then they were called colored conferences. Right? I have with me Pastor John Boston, who is the senior pastor of Shiloh, Seventh-day Adventist Church here in Chicago. That was perhaps the central church as it relates to that particular, the central church in the city, the meeting place prior to the General Conference meeting. Elder Boston, please, first of all, thank you for joining us. Thank you for arranging for us to meet in this historic meeting, historic hotel, which we are in. So Elder Boston, would you please introduce the gentleman that you have with us?
So glad to be here, Elder Edmonds. Thank you for telling this story. Elder Uncle Arthur Webb is he is a member, an elder of the Shiloh Church. He's also a clinical social worker, community organizer, and the raiser of 3 young adults that are still active and leading in the Adventist Church. And David Graham is also a minister of music at Shiloh, and he is a big brother, but he is a phenomenal gift to the body. His grandmother was here in 44 when that meeting was held in this room. And Elder Webb's mother was a young adult who passed through Shiloh and then went on to Motor City to raise a family, and he couldn't help but come back to this place.
All right, so thank you, gentlemen. Tell us, in your case, Brother Webb, tell us a little bit about your mom, who was a member of Shiloh.
That's my mom at that time, Mary Ola Slayton, as her maiden name was. I would like to say I see her as this daring, young, charming 20-year-old woman who was raised in Brightly, Michigan, which was at that point a bastion of the growing Adventist movement at that point. So she left home and came to Chicago, where in 1938 she tells me stories about her pastor, at that time Pastor Allison. She was very fond. She said it had a lot of activities for young people. She felt comfortable, and she couldn't wait for Sabbath to roll around when they came. So I'm grateful, for that. And here I am making a reconnection to that. But as I said, my mom was a dedicated Christian, and as she grew older, she became very active in civil rights movements and other. In fact, she attended the March on Washington, D.C. with Dr. King in 1963. So she had this movement, this desire within her to stand up, and not just to stand up, but to do something about standing up when she stood up.
All right, Brother Graham, tell us about your grandmother, who was a delegate back in 1944, who in this room voted the establishment of regional conferences.
Yeah, so I have to be transparent up front. A lot of my stories come from me sitting and listening to my father and his brothers and sisters who were the children of Mary Senator Graham, and listening and eavesdropping and listening to the history and how it was established and getting an idea of the atmosphere and the excitement back then. She was on the record as probably the first Bible worker for the Lay Region Conference, from what I understand. But more importantly, I remember them talking about she was one of the laymen that established one of two evangelistic series that baptized hundreds of black people during that time, that served as the basis and constituency and the groundwork for the need for the Black Adventist movement in the Adventist Church, and later on matriculated into a pre-civil rights movement for the representation of Black Adventists in the Adventist Church. So the need predicated the need for the regional conferences. So I listened, and I can replay in my mind my father, who was the youngest of seven, playing in his mind the conversations that they listened to and they heard, and he listening to his older brothers and sisters telling him, "No, Calvin, you've got that wrong." And as far as referencing the civil rights movement, he was one of the first African Americans to be a part of the University of Louisville Surgical School, and he was down there right in the middle of the civil rights movement. He was going to school down there, so he marched with the young Jesse Jacksons and the Bobby Rushes, and while he was in med school in secret, because it wasn't a time where they were trying to matriculate African Americans. They just wanted to accept them because it came with a certain amount of funding, and the plan was not to matriculate them. So having grown up in an environment where in Chicago, downtown Chicago, where he had a mother who was raising 7 kids and pushing them and understanding the importance of having a black church supporting the Black Adventist movement in a black Christian school under a regional conference gave them voice in this ministry that they had fallen in love with. It was extremely important. And it was the basis for everything my father did, and my aunts and uncles. It was the basis.
Shiloh is probably the only church, only African American church back there in 1944. And my understanding is that some of the meetings before the meetings happen in Shiloh. So let's talk about, let's try to share with our audience what kind of church Shiloh was. Did anybody have any idea, for example, roughly? Well, tell us what your mother told you about what kind of church Shiloh was back in those days.
Well, like I said, it was a friendly church. Had a lot to do for her as a young woman growing up and living in the city of Chicago. And it had enough attraction for her not to be able to wait until Sabbath rolled around again. It said a lot about the safety and environment, and also about the truth of Christ, of which she always taught us about. In fact, she had a picture of Christ, and it was always hung in my mind at our front door. And it was that door, the picture of Christ, the image, where he's knocking on the door. And she would always sing that song, "Somebody's knocking on my door. Sounds like Jesus. Why don't you answer?" So to this day, that's still resounding to me. So it speaks a lot what was cultivated in her and in her practice and her lifestyles as a result of being in Chicago. And then also, as she matriculated to Detroit, she maintained that same fervor and stamina. So it started at Shiloh, and it certainly continued as she enjoined her membership to the Burns Seventh-day Adventist Church at that time there, but was a larger part of what was a citywide movement called the Better Living Center, which was this conglomerate of evangelism for Detroit. And she would attend those meetings every night too. So that says a lot about what was cultivated within her while she was at Shiloh.
Let's talk about the meeting itself. Your grandmother was a delegate.
Yes.
What do you remember her saying about the meeting, about the general environment, about the feelings of the membership in Shiloh relative to regional conferences?
So keeping it, all my experiences are relaying the energy after every Sabbath dinner. My family had a tradition where we had Sabbath dinner every Sabbath with family, whether it was at my aunt's and uncle's house. They all lived in one building in 3 floors, and each aunt and uncle lived on a floor, or it was at my father's house. And every Sabbath, we had dinner there. It was a place where anybody could come and eat. Amen. And that was harbored by a concept, to whom much is given, much is required. Mm-hmm. But my grandmother and my father and aunts and uncles did not have a whole lot. And the energy that I received, Shiloh, during that time, it was a hub, it was a safe space. We're talking about pre-civil rights. It was a safe space in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the ghetto of Chicago on the south side, where not just black Adventism took place, but black dreams for education, being more than just a postal worker, or being more than just what was acceptable, socially acceptable for black people in society back then, where they could dream. I remember my father and aunts talking about situations like skating parties on the gym floor that cost a penny. And then they'd have movies that cost a penny. And I remember my father talking about, they were so poor, they didn't have the money, so they would sit outside of the movie and they would act and portray what they heard. It's all coming back to me. A lot of it's coming back to me now.
It's been a long time.
It's been a long time because I would be listening to my father and listen to them, and I'd pay attention. But the feel I got, it was energy, it was excitement, it was a safe place in a scary time where little colored kids were not accepted and not really encouraged to dream. From what I can gather, my grandmother was a very independent, fearless woman. There was a time where my family lived with a family from Michigan, the Bland family, and it was 7 of them, and maybe, I'm not sure how many grandchildren, but they both shared a 2-bedroom apartment. And just, I can only imagine that all they had was their dreams. All they had was the ability to dream about what they wanted to do. So Shiloh was a hub for that. There were people that were coming from other states. I remember them saying there was Wednesday night prayer meeting. There were meetings in that church and in different houses centered around Shiloh every week, every day of the week, coming together, dreaming, saying and believing that this is what we're going to do. So I can imagine the spirit of wanting their own. Wanting their own representation, wanting to worship the way they wanted to worship under the Black Adventist movement umbrella, I can imagine, fostered the need and the push for regional conferences, because that was the only way. My father really talked about, that's all he would ever talk, regional conferences. He interfaced with guys like Dudley and different ministerial guys. He was the layman, speaking very openly and cleanly in a time where it was not encouraged. So Shiloh was a hub of activity. My grandmother, I heard stories about her being and it reminded me of being at that meeting. I don't have a lot of memories about that, but knowing what I've heard about my grandmother, she wasn't a woman that would bite her tongue. She was a humble woman, but she didn't bite her tongue, and she was very adamant about the Black Adventist movement and the representation of Black Adventists under this umbrella that we call the Adventist Church.
Elder Boston, we'll close with you. First of all, I'm going to ask you about the hotel itself, because you are the one that arranged for us to be here. But first, we'll start off with, tell us a little bit about you, your ministry. We'll skip over the part where you turned me down when I asked you to come to South Central. We'll skip over that part. But tell us a little about your ministry.
Oh, forgive me.
Then we'll talk
And we're
about
so
the hotel.
grateful he did.
No, Elder Edmonds, it's hard sitting in an interview to capture all the stories, but when I listen to Elder Webb or David Graham talk, I am really clear about what they're experiencing as an outsider. 5 blocks in one direction of where Shiloh was the house of Al Capone. On State Street, it was largely owned by individuals from the Greek community. You have Mamie Till lived 9 blocks in another direction. Mahalia Jackson was singing on a corner, not even a mile away. Thomas Dorsey was playing a piano and inventing gospel music, not even a mile away. And so you're talking about a group of people that embraced an identity and said, we're going to move forward. From 1905 to 1944, they were at the Chicago Southside Church, and there was black services and there was white services. And by 1969, they had built at that time one of the largest Adventist facilities in America, and still standing today. And so I think Shiloh represents a lot of things, but one thing that it does not lack is a heritage of people that found a way to advance the 3 angels' message of Revelation 14, 6 through 12, while doing that in the armor of our culture and our voice and our identity. And so as for me, I'm just a doorkeeper at Shiloh. I try to facilitate their vision. I believe God gave them a brilliant vision. And I think that that's expressed in, for us, David Graham's mother once said, we didn't just have a school of hundreds of African-American children because it was a missional idea. We had to do it to survive, to protect our children. And this is what was happening in 44, and by the time you got to 45, when Lake Region came along, and 69, when the church was built, Elder Webb talks about his mother recalling their pastor would walk, one of the pastors of Shiloh at the time, you're talking about a mile from the church. Now, I don't know that I would do that without a Kevlar-coated suit per se, but I certainly think that Shiloh is, when I think of Shiloh, Oakwood is our institutional church. Shiloh is our church. That is the church of Black Adventism that says we showed up when Al Capone was on the corner And we showed up, they're trees that David's grandmother planted and before they even built, and said, we're going to have this tree here for future generations. And I think that is what Shiloh represents. It represents a legacy of Adventism that honors culture as God speaks to us through it.
Now we're here. We've said from the beginning we wanted to tape this program from the room where the General Conference voted. So now there are other hotels around here. Why did the General Conference choose this hotel?
In 1944, while Chicago was a bastion of hope for persons moving from the South, African American persons, the Stevens Hotel, which Hilton acquired some 30, 40 years later, the Stevens Hotel was the largest facility on Lake Shore that would allow for integrated public gatherings. And so when the General Conference, which is it's not even 60 years old at this point, right? They needed a place where people of color and people that lacked that level of melanin could gather in one place in a public setting. And so that's why they chose this space. These chandeliers behind us were the ones that were here in 1944. The ornate features on the walls, besides minor touch-ups, these were the walls and the fixtures that were in place in 1944. The only thing that's changed are the floors, the covering of the floors, and of course electrical for obvious reasons. And so this space is significant. While it is now known as the Hilton Chicago, it represented a groundbreaking environment for this movement.
Okay, what role from your because you're a historian.
No. He's the historian.
No,
He's the listen to my grandparents, and I'm gonna tell you the story.
No, I've spoken to you, and you have an interest in history.
Amen.
So from your study and from your discussion with your members, what have you been able to gather about the role that Shiloh played in the establishment of a Lake Region?
Well, it wasn't even a month later. Once they gathered at Shiloh near Dearborn, the original gathering space, or second, Ford was the first pastor at the time, and by the time 44 came along, there was a vested interest for Shiloh to set a pace. Now, I will say, I don't want to paint a picture that our white brothers and sisters were adamantly against. The fact that they chose Stevens so that everybody could meet together was an indication that we were still close to that initial movement of fighting against segregation and fighting against oppression in this country. That was the identity of Adventism. So for Shiloh, what was unique about Shiloh is that it became a bastion of ideas about best practices to advance mission. I think the fact that the school had 417 children within its first 10 years is an indication of the level of commitment. David Graham's grandmother or family, they're in shared living quarters, but she raised doctors and pharmaceutical representatives and teachers. Elder Webb became, his mother was a young adult, and she went on to establish a family, and she's got young people that said, we're going to be educators. Now he's got kids that are educators, brilliant educators and media leaders, and David now has children. I think that was because of Shiloh. Shiloh said, we're going to preserve the future. We're going to embrace where we came from, and we are going to provide an environment where those things can be safe. The future can be safe, and the past can be remembered.
Amen.
Okay, my final question. Again, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for giving your time and sharing the story both of Shiloh and Lake Region. Pastor, my last question is, tell us, we've talked about what the Shiloh and Lake Region in the past. Tell us about Shiloh today. What are some of its strengths? What are some of its challenges?
Well, Shiloh it still operates the oldest school established for children in primary school in the country, 111-year-olds that's still serving, that's still operating. And because they're much older schools, and of course training schools, colleges and universities that are still older and operating, but this is still a primary school. And it's in a renaissance right now, for lots of different reasons. Some pastoral leadership, sometimes member leadership, the conference. When Shiloh sat at the table, members of Shiloh largely, to instigate the movement of Lake Region Conference, the idea was not that we just simply need to only serve black people. The idea was we need to effectively reach urban persons. And I think Shiloh is still deeply committed to that. Recently, Shiloh launched Shiloh in Espanol. You still have the school. There is, I believe, one of the largest, healthiest, most successful Sabbath morning children's ministry initiatives called Kids Camp. You have a rich heritage of music. On Sabbath morning when David lead music, or he'll ask Elder Well, he'll say, tell Elder Well lead the hymn. Well, just let him do it. So you've got the rich heritage of music. I think it's interesting. Shiloh, although gospel music was born a mile away, Shiloh has an Allen organ and not necessarily a Hammond B3, which is an indication of the broadness of the heritage of its musical identity. And even now, we're talking about opening a mental health clinic, free grocery store. We are owning half of a city block on 71st in South Michigan. And I think that the general idea is we need to do more. One of the biggest challenges we face is that there is probably a lack of understanding of what Shiloh represents. Shiloh saw more people baptized than most churches in North America over the last year. I am there because I've spent most of my ministry serving white farmers in South Africa, or indigenous persons in Australia, or people displaced in the West Indies. And I want to spend the last days that I have in ministry until Jesus comes rebuilding the African American community. It's uncomfortable to walk into a church in another country and not have people from that country in that church. And I think Shiloh needs to effectively reach the 82% African Americans in the South Side of Chicago, and effectively reach the 56% of African Americans in the city of Chicago. And I think in doing so, in the words of the current mayor, Brandon Johnson, when we experience black liberation, it affects liberation for all people. It makes a difference for everybody. We don't want the black to be guilty of doing to the brown what the white did to the black. And so we've got to figure out how to live for everybody. My hope is that soon we'll have multiple campuses across Chicago, and I'll walk away and gallop into the sunset, or Jesus will be here when Shiloh is back where it belongs as the leader in Black Adventist ministry.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your sharing this historic time, the celebration of a decision made in this room that changed the Adventist Church. And thank you for sharing your perspective. We now move live to the historic First Seventh-day Adventist Church in Washington, D.C. I'm Elder Dana C. Edmond, and with me are my co-hosts, Elder Gerson Pancorbo and Ms. Rebecca Bell Jackson. Coordinating this from the opposite end of the country is our producer, Elder Barone Savory. We want to thank you for being able to pull all of this together. We have, to end our program, we have an eclectic group of guests that we're going to introduce over the next several minutes. The first one is the senior pastor of the First Seventh-day Adventist Church, Pastor Lisa Smith-Reid. First of all, Pastor, thank you for opening up your church to us. And Pastor Smith-Reid, we're talking about Adventist history. You are an historic figure in your own right. The first African-American female pastor in the history of regional conferences. And so tell us, besides that, begin our program by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I can say that, first of all, let me just say we're glad that you could start this program here at First Church because I think the church needs to know a little bit about the history um, of regional work as well as the history of this wonderful church here on 810 Shepherd Street Northwest. But I've been here for about 8 years now, and I am enjoying the ministry here at First Church. I grew up as an Adventist, been an Adventist all my life, raised by a single mom who was also Adventist. I am a uh, fourth generation Adventist and a third generation Oakwoodite. I have to put that in there because Oakwood always gets the plug. And so those things I'm proud of because they mean a lot to me to have been able to be a part of that experience. I am a graduate, as I said, of Oakwood in theology, and I went on to Andrews to get my master's of divinity, and I've been pastoring now about 36 years.
Amen. So tell us a little bit about the building in which we sit. First Church, tell us about the demographics and our location.
Okay, you're in Northwest DC. We have been in this building, I think, about since 1956, if I'm not mistaken. And this building has been our home. We've been through a lot when it comes to this building with many renovations and always trying to update and work in this building to make sure that it represents who God would have it to represent. And because we're in Northwest, Northwest has changed since we've moved here. Many of you don't know, but this church is 135 years old, and it has been in different locations. And this is the last one that we've been in so far. And when we first moved here, it was many of African American descent was in this area. So it was a good area for us. And many of our members, when we first moved here, lived within this area. This church now is a commuter church. The majority of the members live outside of this area. They come from all areas in the Maryland, DC area. And so they travel to come here. We're also been gentrified in this area. And because of gentrification, it has changed quite a bit. And it has made it a little bit more difficult for us to evangelize in this area. But we have not given up. We're still evangelizing, still trying to do what God has asked us to do until God tells us otherwise. As long as we're sitting on this corner, we will try to evangelize each and every person in this area. We have started a church in our basement that is a Spanish church. And let me say this, if we didn't start a church, we have combined a church. We brought in a Spanish group, which is a part of First Church, but they speak Spanish. So we don't worship in the same area every Sabbath. But they are members of this church. And so because this area has a lot of Hispanic in this area, and we felt as long as we're here, we will work with whoever's here because God's word has no ethnic group. God's word has no color. It is colorblind. And so it is our responsibility to reach out to whomever. And so that's what we are, and that's where we sit.
Okay, so do you all have any members here who are descendants of the people who made the vote to establish the regional conferences?
We try to do some research on that, and as far as I know, we don't. We do have some that are at the DuPont Park Church. DuPont Park is our sister church. Us being the first church, that's why we call the First Church and not First Church. Being the first church, our sister church is DuPont. They came right out of us. And so many number of them that were here or family that was here are now members of the DuPont Church rather than at First Church.
So, Pastor Smith, what are some of this church strengths? And I'm sure you have some challenges.
Oh, we have a lot of challenges.
Let's start with the strengths first. Let's give some good news.
Well, I believe some of our strengths are we are willing to do what it takes to try to reach out to everyone. We do evangelism or reach out every fifth Sabbath is our active Sabbath when we actually leave and go out. But throughout the community, we do feed in our community here at the church. We have now just began to decide to really focus clearly on our young people, the children, because we know that if we can reach the children, maybe we can reach the parents. It's unfortunate that when um, we don't all want to worship together if we don't look like our brothers and sisters. And it's not because we don't like each other, it's because as human beings, we like to be around people that look like us or come from where we come from. You know, it's something that connects us as human beings. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult. Plus, we know that we're living in the last days and there's so much out there that distracts people that they don't really want to hear anything that's going to make them have to change their lives. So we figure if we work with their children, then children have a tendency to go home and share with their parents, and then their parents will come along and be with us. So those are some of our challenges. And so some of our strengths is that we're willing to do that and we are doing it. And by God's grace, we will see the fruit of our labor.
All right, thank you, Pastor Smith-Reid. We have two other guests. And the reason why we're here at First Church is that vote in 80 years ago, in 1944, from the General Conference that established Regional Conference, probably the single greatest influence on that vote were a group of laymen who came out of First Church. And we want to tell their story. And we have probably the two preeminent historians of Black Adventism with us on our panel, one of whom wrote a book about that group called Change Agents. And so we're very happy to have Dr. Benjamin Baker, who has a website on Black Adventism and who probably knows more about the history of Black Adventism than anybody in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And alongside of him is Dr. Douglas Morgan. Dr. Morgan wrote the book about these laymen who formed a committee that influenced the vote that established regional conferences. The book is called Change Agents. And we are just excited to have them. And they are going to tell us the story about that group that came out of First Church that changed the history of Adventism by leading out in the vote to establish regional conferences. Dr. Baker, Dr. Morgan, thank you for being with us and sharing your expertise.
So welcome. Thank you so much. We would like for you all to share just a little bit of your background and what drew you to the study of African American history in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We'll start with Dr. Baker.
First of all, it is a pleasure to be here with you all in this historic church and on this historic program. I first became interested in Black Adventist history during my formative years. My father was studying a man named William Foy, and William Foy actually received divine revelations before Ellen White, and he was a Black Millerite. So during my formative years, when I was 8, 9, 10, 11, my father was studying William Foy, and I can say that that's when I developed a love for Seventh-day Adventist history. And as I got older, my father continued to write books on Adventist history, and it sort of just developed from there. I currently teach at Howard University, which is just down the road. I teach history and religion at Howard University. And as Elder Edmund said, I operate a website called blacksdahistory.org. Blacksdahistory.org. It's also pronounced blacksdahistory.org. Some of you all may get that later, but please be sure to visit the website. That website is for you. It's for you, and it has an accompanying YouTube channel also called Black SDA History.
Yes, Dr. Morgan, would you please share what drew you?
Well, let me also first say what a privilege it is to be back here at this wonderful house of worship. I was here 10 years ago for the 125th anniversary celebration, but this is my first time to be in the completely renovated sanctuary, and it is beautiful, and it's just wonderful to be here. And it was in, I think, the year 2001 that the then pastor of this congregation, Dr. Mark McCleary, got in touch with me. I was teaching just up the road in Tacoma Park at Washington Adventist University. And he said, this church has a great history and it really needs to be written. And I was intrigued by that. And long story short, that really was a pivot for me going deeper than I ever expected, and finding a great interest in Black Adventist history. It wasn't really the first interest I'd had in that. Briefly, my formative years were in the late 1960s, early 70s, and somehow I was just interested in politics and history, and the great issues were race relations, civil rights, and Vietnam War and the peace movement and so forth. But I just was interested in how those related to my Adventist faith. So that is what I've pursued in my graduate studies, and I did my thesis, which became a book, Adventism in the American Republic, which included the issue of race prior to a very providential, I think, turn of events that got me into not only researching and writing the history of this congregation, but then going on to do more in Black Adventist history.
Dr. Baker, at this point, we know that in 1944, something happened in the General Conference. But can you tell us something about the social and political climate in the United States at that time?
Three of the most consequential developments in American history were occurring or had occurred around 1943, 1944. I would love some audience participation, but maybe we're not doing that now. It looks like the audience is raring. I would love to hear you talk to me. What do you think? What three events, what three vital, consequential events, 1943, 1944, going on in the United States? First of all, there was the Great Migration. The Great Migration, which is the largest population shift in American history. When 6 to 7 million African Americans are migrating, relocating from the rural South to the urban South, to the North, and later to the West. I'm sure many of us here are in Washington, D.C. I don't know if you consider Washington, D.C. to be North or South, but many of us are here because of the Great Migration. Regional conferences and their creation are very much rooted in this Great Migration. The second consequential event in American history, Gerson, is the Great Depression, which is the largest economic recession in at least recent modern world history. Okay, and this This Great Depression, one of the ways that the American government tried to alleviate the Great Depression was what? The New Deal. Come on now. This, this is, yeah, someone's getting it. This is rooted in the history of regional conferences, because what's the name of the circular of this group of lay people? What is it? Shall the four freedoms, right, function among Seventh-day Adventists? And this is FDR's inaugural address. Okay, so this is a movement really on the tail end of the Great Depression and the New Deal, and the Great War that, I don't know, alleviated or was one of the products of the Great Depression was World War II. And so some of these catalytic events of the regional conferences are happening right during wartime. Right during wartime. Now, these three consequential developments are all heavily impacting Black Seventh-day Adventists. Not only Black Seventh-day Adventists, but the larger African American community. And scholars are now citing this period as really the birth of the modern civil rights movement. Some people put it in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education and the Montgomery bus boycotts, but other scholars put it right around 1943 with our Adventist pioneer, Irene Morgan. Maybe we can talk about her another time, but really with some of the prejudices of the New Deal, the valorous participation of African Americans in World War II, and the general overthrow of, sorry, Gerson, I'm giving you a lot, but the general overthrow of white colonial and imperial powers of World War II are causing African Americans to fight for their rights here in the United States. And the fight for rights within the Seventh-day Adventist Church is a byproduct of the larger African American and our independent struggles all around the world that came after World War II. After World War II, almost all of the colonial countries have independence movements.
Okay, I want to follow up on that in a minute, but let me go. You mentioned Irene Morgan, and you have to remember you're the historian, and so you know all this. But everybody may not know who Irene Morgan is. So tell us real quickly, who was Irene Morgan?
Irene Morgan was a Seventh-day Adventist woman who lived in Baltimore, Maryland, right down the road, if you will, and she had a very traumatic miscarriage. She went to her kin in Virginia, and she was mending, and she was given family support, and she's coming back up to Baltimore, Maryland, and she's on the Greyhound bus, and of course then we have Jim Crow segregation in the public transportation system, and they are at a stop in Hayes Store, Virginia. Small town, really just a stop in the road. And she is told to vacate her seat. She is actually in the colored section, but she's told to vacate her seat because the bus is full, and the first people in the colored section would have to get up and let white people sit down. And so the woman next to her who has a baby, she vacates her seat, and a white woman sits down, and then her white husband, is waiting for Irene Morgan to get up. And Irene Morgan is not going to get up. She took a seated stand, if you will. Are you all with me? A seated stand. She refuses to get up. And so the bus driver who adjudicates these sorts of things, he says, get up. He's yelling at her. He's calling her some pejoratives. She refuses to get up. He gets out, calls the sheriff and the deputy. The white sheriff and the deputy come in, and they give Irene Morgan some sort of paper. I think it may be an order or a warrant for her to get up. She tears it in half in front of their faces and throws it out the open window. Folks, we're talking about a Seventh-day Adventist woman here from Baltimore okay? And she's actually also a product of World War II because she's working at a munitions factory in Baltimore. Okay, so this is grounded in what's going on. And so the the sheriff makes a miscalculation and tries to physically remove Irene Morgan, and she proceeds to kick him in the testicles. They finally move her from the bus and they jail her. So this is a woman. She just had a miscarriage, a black woman. She's all alone in this prison. She gets threats from the KKK and other white terrorist organizations, but she refuses to fold. And to make a long story short, she will not pay the fine for refusing to get off the bus. And a young lawyer from Baltimore, the airport's now named after him. Do you know who? Thurgood Marshall. He takes up her case. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, 1944, Morgan v. Virginia. Her case overturns racial seating, racial segregation on public transportation. Folks, please give it up. Please do something. Do something. So this is an Adventist woman from Baltimore.
All right, that's a powerful story of Rosa Banks before Rosa Banks.
10 years.
Yeah. I'm not sure not sure I would recommend everything that she did, but we celebrate her bravery. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Baker, for that. Dr. Morgan, this is 1944. The United States was very segregated. How did that affect the Seventh-day Adventist Church?
Well, as Dr. Baker pointed out, we usually think of civil rights movement. We think of the mid-50s into the 60s, Martin Luther King, SCLC, SNCC, and all of that. Absolutely central importance. But there was major changes already afoot, as he pointed out, in the early 1940s, whereby we might think of the American society as just sort of taking a slow turn in a more positive direction as far as race relations is concerned. But my contention is that in this very same time period, going back to approximately the mid-20s up to the early 40s, our Adventist church, unfortunately, had been retrogressing, going in the opposite direction in terms of representation, the role of Black membership in the church and Black leadership having a voice and so forth, but also with regard to our institutions, admission of African Americans, quotas where some were admitted at colleges and hospitals. Things were actually getting worse. So you have this pressure building up where we can, the people that decided to take action could see, look, things are getting better, but we're lagging behind.
I'm tempted to go further than that, but let me go in another direction. There were two very gifted prior to the establishment of regional conferences. There were two very gifted preachers and pastors, evangelists, Louis Sheaf and J.K. Humphreys. Tell us about them.
Well, Louis Sheaf had been a Baptist minister, and this is now going way back, close to the beginnings of any organized efforts to reach African Americans on the part of the Adventist Church. And he was the third Black person in the period of General Conference organization to be an ordained Black Adventist minister. This was 1896. He was an amazingly gifted evangelist and singer. And he came to Washington, D.C. in 1902. There was already a church, racially integrated church, but he had a spectacularly successful evangelistic effort in this city in 1902, 1903. And as Pastor Reid was pointing out earlier, Um, this is where we have the first church. This was the first church, essentially, that he came to. And he built that up. And then he started what was then called the People's Church, which through some historical changes became the DuPont Park Church today. Now, he comes into our story, especially now, unfortunately, at the very time that these congregations are being built up, we're having the General Conference moving its headquarters in 1903 from Battle Creek to Washington, D.C., Tacoma Park, straddling the line there. And we have a new college formed and a new sanitarium set up. And it turns out then that the Black Adventists in the area are not going to be allowed access either as students or patients or personnel. So their plea was, the plea from the People's Church in 1906, they put in a petition to the General Conference. They said, well, could you tell us where we can be accommodated in Seventh-day Adventist institutions? If not, if there is no such and there are no plans to develop alternative ones for us, may we just keep our own money rather than send it in to the General Conference.
So they said the magic word, we're going to keep our tithe.
Right. So it's a long, a long story after that, but I think what's most pertinent for our story today is that really it was picking up the unfinished business that was left to fester. And although attempts were made, for example, over and over, there were committees formed trying to establish what they call the school in the north, or sometimes the school in the east, so that there would be an alternative for African American Adventists, an alternative to sending their young people to the deep south, to Oakwood, but it somehow never worked out, so that the injustices that led Sheaf then to separate ultimately from the denomination really were never dealt with and only got worse, and that all fed up to the 1943 situation.
Okay, that's Pastor Sheaf. Tell us about Elder Humphreys.
James Kimule Humphrey. Is anyone here from Jamaica? Anybody represent? Okay, well, almost half the audience. It's a pleasure. James K. Humphrey was born in Jamaica in 1877. And by the way, early Black Adventism is an advertisement for African Americans and Caribbean Americans working together. What do you say? James, yes. James K. Humphrey, yeah, we built this together. James K. Humphrey was born in 1877 in Jamaica. He is a Baptist minister, and he is going to Africa, apparently on a Baptist mission trip. And so he goes he sails from Kingston to New York City. And in New York City, there is an extended layover, and he happens into an Adventist evangelistic meeting. Now, this is providential we're talking about now. This is providential. And he actually converts to Seventh-day Adventism on that layover. Yes. And instead of going to Africa, he becomes a Seventh-day Adventist minister in New York City. And he rivals Sheaf, not that they were rivals, but he rivals Sheaf in being one of the most effective black, not just black, as John Harvey Kellogg would say of Sheaf, of any race, a minister of any race in the denomination. James K. Humphrey is the quintessential big city evangelist. I would say even more than someone like William Simpson or something.
Kellogg said, "We have not a white minister that can begin to stand next to him."
Yes. By the way, I was talking to Dr. Morgan, I would say 15 years ago at Washington Adventist University, and maybe 20 years ago. And Dr. Morgan said that he wanted to be the world's leading sheepologist. Louis Sheaf, and he has written the book on Louis Sheaf some 500 pages, and I said, you now know more about Louis Sheaf than his mother probably did. So he is indeed the world's leading sheepologist. Anyhow, James K. Humphrey is a charismatic figure. He's a compelling personality. He's spirit-led, and he is a powerful evangelist. And he wins probably over 1,000 souls in New York City. He rockets up the leadership chain of Adventism, even though he basically remains a pastor. He is a General Conference delegate. He's on numerous committees, and from his church, which becomes Ephesus, he births like 3 or 4 other churches in New York City. But he is also a Garveyite, sort of like a follower of Marcus Garvey, or at least he has a Garvey-like consciousness. This is one of the products of the Great Migration, and that is the networking and the giving and taking of ideas, and the urbanity and cosmopolitan nature, and the even politicization of African Americans and Caribbean Americans. And so James K. Humphrey wants to do something for his race, and like Louis Sheaf, he sees in Seventh-day Adventism a package of truths that can uplift Black people. That's what he sees in Seventh-day Adventism. And so he goes about, he's one of the progenitors, along with Charles M. Kinney, of the regional conference idea, of the notion of regional conferences, because he believes that he's mission-minded. So he believes this could be the most effective way to get this life-saving message to my people. Okay, so he's a pastor of a large 600-member church in Harlem, and he has a plan to start a holistic institute for Black people in the country, sort of like as Ellen White prescribes, which would be New Start or Creation, natural living and a good diet, a vegetarian diet, and clean air and country living. But to make a long story short, the white conference officers have a different plan for Humphrey, and they think that he's acting autonomously. And like I said, there's a lot of church politics, which I suggest that you don't get involved in. But there are some politics, and Humphrey and his church ultimately end up leaving the Seventh-day Adventist Church to form a new faith tradition called Sabbath-day Adventists. And Humphrey leaves the church, and he does not come back, and he dies in 1952.
Dr. Baker, we know about Lucy Bayer. Everybody should know about Lucy Bayer. Probably there won't be even regional conferences without Lucy Bayer. Can you tell us, please, a brief story about this lady?
Yes, Lucy Bayard. Lucy Bayard, please Google her. Google her. Lucy, last name Byard. Please Google her, bookmark it. Some websites should come up, probably the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists article on her. She's a crucial person for you to know. Lucy Bayard was a saint. And by a saint, I mean, do you know that person who's always giving Bible studies, who participates in ingathering, who always has people over her house, who plays the piano? That was Lucy Bayard. That was Lucy Bayard. She was born in the South, 1870 something. My memory's failing me. I'm getting older. So she was born in the South, but anyhow, she actually moved to New York City in the Great Migration, and she was one of the pioneers, albeit untouted, because she wasn't a white male or because she wasn't a male, but she was one of the pioneers of Adventism and Black Adventism in New York City. She was giving Bible studies. She was doing humanitarian work. She was supporting. Anyhow, in the early 1940s, Lucy Bayard was now in her 60s, and she develops liver cancer. She develops liver cancer. And like the woman in the Gospels, she goes to all of the physicians and she can't find a cure. She's in New York City, Jamaica, Queens. So, as a last resort, she says, I will go to the Adventist Sanitarium in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Okay, so that's what she says, because she says, then the sanitarium model, it was a bit different from hospitals because they had a lifestyle element attached to it. So there was a social component, and there was nature, and there was diet. So it was more holistic. So she said, maybe this will help, and if not, at least I can spend my last days among my family of Adventists. So she and her husband James, long story short, they arrange for her to be admitted for liver cancer at the Washington Sanitarium. She doesn't really have enough money to pay for it, so there is sort of also an economic element to this, but they raise money and they help her out, and so she's admitted, and it's all set. And so she and her husband, because of war prices, once again, we're seeing the World War II, they take the train down. They arrive at Washington Sanitarium September 22, 1943. Okay, now it's often been said in the retelling that Lucy Byard walked in and they didn't know that she was black because she was light-skinned, but that's not what happened. They actually saw that she was black right away. She and her husband were visibly black, if you will. Is that fine to say? She and her husband were conspicuously black, but they didn't know from the application. So the manager in charge there, I ironically named Baker. He was a white man named Baker, and he made it very clear. I'm making a long story short. He made it very clear to Lucy and her husband, James Byard, that they were not wanted in the Washington Sanitarium. Okay, that was made very clear to them. Now they said, usually because of Maryland law, that's a big thing, hiding behind the state laws or what have you. And our clientele here, they're from the Carolinas, and they wouldn't feel comfortable with a black person. So maybe you can go down in the basement. And they made it very clear to her that she wasn't wanted. Okay, and I think that they indicated that you can't be admitted here. Okay, so they said, but we'll get you a cab to go across town to the Freedmen's Hospital, which is now Howard University Hospital. Ironically, Elder Edmond, it is operated by Adventists now. So she goes across town with her husband, and they alert the director of the color department, G.E. Peters, as to what happened. Actually, 38 days transpire. And so she's at the Freedmen's Hospital, and she's treated by an Adventist doctor there named J. Mark Cox. And he actually worked with Charles Drew. So this is deep into Black history. And so she ended up dying 38 days later from cachexia, which is like a wasting away. That is a side effect of liver cancer. So that's the story of Lucy Byard.
Okay, so because there are different versions.
Yes.
I remember when they told us the story when I was growing up that they stuck her in the hallway and she died. And so the story wasn't accurate, but the good part was at least they told the story. They didn't tell it completely accurate, and there are various versions. But she is denied admission or unadmitted, whatever happened. I suppose it was the next Sabbath, because of the uproar that occurred in this church in particular, at First Church. The General Conference vice president, I think it's a man named Turner, is that his name?
Yes.
Yeah, came and preached and made matters worse. So tell us what happened.
Sure. So just to set the scene, it was not quite the next week, but it was during that month where she was still alive and it was still very, fresh and recent. And you have two Black Adventist congregations. This one and Ephesus, as it was called then, became DuPont Park. And so Elder Turner, I think that we do need to also just bring onto the scene here a man named G.E. Peters. There's an Adventist school, I think, around here that's named for him. So, but Elder Peters was head of what was then called the North American Colored Department. And he has been on a tightrope of negotiation and diplomacy with the General Conference leadership for years, and things are building up. But he goes in to the General Conference officers meeting, I believe it was October 3, and he tells them, look, this is, the laity are just outraged about this. And so then Turner says, well, I will go down, and he wanted to go to the Ephesus church to preach and try to calm down the situation. He was the General Conference vice president for North America. And it's interesting, but he was of Australian heritage, but he was assigned to North America. I say that because Elder Peters warned him. Now, because I think Elder Peters knew that Turner was probably not the man to do it. But Turner felt he had dealt with people of color in the South Pacific Islands. And so he thought that he could handle this situation. And so he goes to the Ephesus church and he preaches on a passage from 1 Peter, think it not strange, brethren, if you go through fiery trials, right? And so Peter's talking about people being persecuted for the sake of Christ. Well, the way that he presented it, and apparently he even also went to the one of those passages that sounds terrible out of context about servants obeying your masters, also in 1 Peter. Elder James Montgomery, the father of Alma Montgomery Blackman, famed musician and Aeolian director, he was the elder of the church and a very respected man in the community as well. It is an important brief background just to set the scene and understand the significance of it. Dignified man. He's a musician. And usually he's going to stand up right at the end of the sermon to lead music somehow. He has his violin up there with him. But this time he stands up right after the sermon, and instead of going into music, he confronts the General Conference vice president. Think it not strange? Yeah, I think it's mighty strange. Adventist schools nearby where I cannot send my children, a denominational cafeteria where I am not permitted to eat. Yes, I think that is very strange. And more to that effect. So this was a dramatic moment. Now, let me just briefly give you, how do we know actually what happened? Well, Jacob Justice, whose sister and others would have been an eyewitness at the time, he wrote a book called Angels in Ebony, which I think is in print again. I'm not completely sure, but it's a gold mine for giving us some vignettes and a lot of information on what happened. So then that very day, though, they decide to organize the committee. So they get leading laity from First Church and Ephesus. They get together, and Elder McElhaney, who's president of the General Conference, agrees to meet with them the next day. So maybe I should stop it there. We can continue the narrative as to how that worked out when we talk a little bit more about the committee.
So the committee came up so organically. Please share some more about what became of the committee. What did they accomplish?
Okay, so they decided that we need to mobilize the Black laity throughout the nation and to set up an organization called, and they called themselves a very long name, the Committee for the Advancement of the Worldwide Work Among Colored Seventh-day Adventists. But the other issue was that the president of the General Conference had agreed to meet with him the next day. So they said, look, we're going to, they pulled an overnighter, and they elected their committee, named their officers, got some letterhead, and drafted an outline of grievances, things that they wanted addressed, because they wanted Elder McElhaney to see that this is not just some little passing, petulant little complaint that will easily be, to just blow over. They wanted him to see that they were serious and they were organized. And so they went to meet with him the next day, and he said, okay, we're going to put this on the agenda for the fall council. And he promised to address it. Now, did we want to talk about some of the individuals on the committee?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's start. I'm going to ask two separate questions about that. First, the one that most of us probably know the most about is Eva B. Dykes. Okay, so I asked Dr. Baker specifically about Eva B. Dykes, who was a member of that committee, and then Dr. Morgan, since you wrote the book, you can give us one or two other prominent people.
Eva B. Dykes, once again, please Google her. The first Black woman to complete the requirements for a PhD. What do you say? The first Black woman, yes. Thank you. She actually was one of 3 Black women who all graduated that summer of 1921. There was Georgiana Simpson, and I'm looking around. The name escapes me, but there is a book, I must plug this, of one of my dear friends, Dr. DeWitt Williams, who you all know, called Breaking Barriers. And it is on the three women who all graduated, the 3 Black women who all graduated with their PhDs in the summer of 1921. So Eva B. Dykes graduates, and she is a professor at Howard University. Now, this is really, I think, instructive for all of us, because let's say with the Black Lives Matter movement and the George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor protests of the summer of 2020, many of us said, hey, I don't want to protest exactly, so what can I do? What can I do to be a part of the cause and to bring about racial justice in the country? The answer is do what you can. Didn't God say to Moses, what's in your hand? You all see where I'm going with this? What's in your hand? So what can you do? Yeah, God may not be calling you to march or protest or pull down, statues, but what can you do to bring about justice in this world? So this is what Eva B. Dykes was dealing with. She was an English scholar. She taught English at Howard University. And so on this committee of very distinguished lay people, Eva B. Dykes did what she did best, and she corrected the grammar and helped write the tract. What do you say? She did what she did best. And so she's also lending her exceptional reputation and standing to this committee. So I don't think that she had an outsized role in it, but she did what was in her expertise, and she lent her influence to the movement.
So the chair of the committee was Joseph Dodson. He was the elder at Ephesus Church, and he was a very successful entrepreneur, bookstore owner, taxi cab company owner, and so forth. And his wife, Williana Dodson, was an educator, and Eva B. Dykes, educator, Helen Sugland, educator. So you kind of get a profile here. James Montgomery, educator. There was a young woman by the name of Valerie Justice. Later she married became Valerie Justice Vance, who was the corresponding secretary. And she was, I think, the one of, if not the most significant mobilizing, driving forces in this committee. She was a social worker. Later, I'm almost certain would be the second Seventh-day Adventist to earn a PhD. Hers was from Ohio State. She was a broadcaster, a journalist, incredible energy. But she was the one who kind of kept things moving forward. She would write Elder McElhaney. Elder McElhaney, you said that you would get back to us about such and such. We haven't heard from you yet. So she and Alma Scott, who was an older, she had become an Adventist in the 19 teens. She was already in her 40s by then. So she is a little bit older, but she's very experienced as an activist. She founded the Southwest Community House, a very significant center for Black youth back in a very impoverished situation. They had educational, cultural opportunity through that center. She was involved with the NAACP, the New Negro Alliance, and she had organized when the president of Howard, Mordecai Johnson, there was some kind of movement afoot to get him out. She mobilized a nationwide campaign to save Mordecai Johnson's job. So she contributed her expertise as to how to put things together. And after their meeting with Elder McElhaney, they sent out letters, no email, no text messages. They made some long distance phone calls, but mainly just letters to Black Adventists that they knew in various cities throughout the United States. So this was a highly accomplished and dedicated group. These were people who were dedicated Seventh-day Adventists, and they were dedicated to using the advantages that they had attained through education to help advance the cause of African Americans, but specifically African American Adventists and their contribution to the mission of this church.
Okay, this committee is made up a little differently than the typical committee. Dr. Morgan, kind of talk to us quickly about the makeup of this committee, because it's different than the typical committee.
So yes, I'm glad you asked that, because these were all lay people. They were outside the structure of the church. They had no voice or standing, really. The other significant thing, maybe you picked up on it already, but I need to underscore it. Women, women were the driving force. Like I say, Elder Dodson was the chair. He played a very important role. Brother Dodson. And there were other males who contributed, but it is the women who really drove the work of this committee forward. So here you have a group of African American lay females who are confronting the white male Adventist General Conference leadership. And Elder Peters helped kind of smooth the way because he's got that intermediary role. He's the head of the North American Negro Department in the General Conference. But this was a lay initiative that was kind of it was very much against the odds of having any kind of success at all. Does that speak? Okay, all right.
So this group of Black lay people were able to get a meeting with the president of the General Conference. I believe his name was Elder McElney.
J.L. McElhaney.
Tell us about him and what role he played in the establishment of the regional conferences. And this question is for Dr. Baker.
Yes. James Lamar McElhaney was one of those, I would say, mid-century Adventist leaders who had seemingly served in dozens of administrative positions. He was born in California in 1880, and his administrative experience was wide. I literally think that he was the president of a dozen administrative units in the church, which is to say that he was a politician. He was a diplomat. Now, this becomes very important because that was probably what was needed to navigate these treacherous waters. Because after the Lucy Byard incident, the church leaders were saying, the white church leaders were saying, this is going to be another Louis Sheaf. This is going to be another J.W. Manns. This is going to be another James K. Humphrey. We're going to lose all these members. It's going to be a public relations disaster. We're going to lose tithe. Sorry, can we just be real here, saints? Right? We're going to lose tithe and standing. Already, you know, there are journalists like your Claude Barnett's, secular journalists, if you will, who are reporting on the discrimination and Jim Crow conditions in Seventh-day Adventism. Okay? And after the Lucy Byard incident, her church in Queens sent a letter to James L. McElhaney saying, if you don't rectify this, we're going to sue you. Okay, so they're facing a lawsuit. It's a public relations disaster. And so McElhaney, who is this lifelong church politician, i.e. diplomat, he extends his skills to the nth degree to navigate these treacherous waters of righteously upset lay people, ministers, white Adventists, and the public who are watching now Adventists to see what they're going to do.
So this question is for both of you. Who were some of the most important leaders and advocates for regional conferences?
Well, that's a very, very important and complex question. But what I'll briefly say is that there were, going back to Charles Kinney, way back in 1889, who was the first black minister to be ordained in the General Conference organization era. And he foresaw the need for the black conferences eventually. But and there were advocates along the way, but it was controversial. There was a push after 1918, 1919, when a man named Green, W.H. Green, became the head of the colored department. Until then, there were white men at the head of the colored department. Anyway, there was a major...
Real quick, did you all get that? There was a Negro department, which was established in 1909, and it went through several different names, Negro, colored, and then it became ethnic, and so there were different names. I think now it's Human Resources. Yeah, now it's the Office of Human Resources now. But initially, for the Negro department, there was a white director or white leader of it. His name was J.W. Christian, then A.J. Hazemer. It wasn't until 1918 when W.H. Green, a black man, could be the director of the Negro department. I want you all to download this.
Excellent, thanks. And so at that moment then, with Green and many of the black Adventist ministers, they said, all right, so the department is fine, but it's the conference that really decides over matters of money, personnel. We need a black conference. Well, that was not well received by the leadership. They set up some commissions and committees, and it's a big part of the Humphrey story in the 20s, because he was pushing for it. Again, not to separate racially, not to seek segregation, but to be able to lead ministry for the community in which they were situated. And so in what I want to just get on the table in terms of context is that in 1930, this is only 13 years before the incident that we're talking about, or the epoch we're talking about, the General Conference said no to black conferences. And not only did they say no, but they said don't bring it up again. So now you have a very complex situation where if you value your employment as a minister, you really cannot say anything. But yet, with these things happening, and when I rehearsed Montgomery's speech for a minute, I forgot to say, he says, and now this incident. In other words, the Bayard incident is just the capstone on building pressure. But you can't really quite say openly that we want regional conferences. So it makes for an interesting diplomatic dance all the way around as we get into this 43 meeting.
If I can also touch on something that Dr. Morgan already emphasized, and that is Black people never wanted to separate. That's important. Black people never wanted to separate. What they saw, or rather foresaw, was that the white brethren were not willing to work with them. They were behaving nastily, in a racist manner toward new Black converts when the churches were mixed, and they were they were offending and traumatizing the new Black converts so deeply that they said, this can't be the real faith. And they would leave the church. Furthermore, they were, and Ellen White is very clear on this, they were defrauding, mismanaging, and purloining funds that were meant for the Black work and arrogating them to the white work, as far as Australia and Europe. And so many of the far-seeing Black ministers, such as Charles Kinney and J.W. Manns and J.K. Humphrey, they were saying, for missional success, so that we can reach Black people, so that Black people won't leave the church in disgust, so that we won't have a schism, we may need separate conferences. Not so that there won't be unity, not so that there won't be the John 17 unity in the body of Christ, but so that we can reach our people with the gospel. So that's a very important point. And even in the discussions about the prospect of regional conferences in 1944, there was division among Black ministers. Many were saying, we can't do this. Okay, we can't have separate conferences. We need to stay together. We don't want to leave. We can work this out. But then the white leaders were saying, no, I think that you all, may need them. This may be best. And so I just want to underscore that Black Adventists never wanted to separate.
So what was the process? Because we cannot talk about them, we don't want them. So what was the process of establishing the regional conference, and how was the opposition within the church? How we address those challenges that we had?
All right, so and the related question then is, what's the relationship of this committee we're talking about to regional conferences? All right, so the committee developed this document. I could almost call it a manifesto, but it's the Four Freedoms document that Dr. Baker referred to. What they called for was complete equality and justice in terms of Black ministers being able to appropriately grow and advance in the church structure, representation on councils and so forth, institutions accepting people regardless of color and so forth. And we could go on about the particulars, but the bottom line, and they put this in the document, and they said, brethren, what is happening now will not stand the acid test of the judgment. we need to consider what Jesus would do. So they put a spiritual foundation for all of this. So this was a spur, because there had been, as I said earlier, committee after committee, a study after study for 30 years, and nothing really had changed. But now this leads McElhaney to call the meeting in Chicago. Special, it was the spring council, but they called a special session to deal with this question, not specifically of Black conferences, but to address the issues. Also, there were some particulars about we want a Black person to edit Message magazine for a while. It had been around for about 10, 12 years, but white brother was the editor until this time. And also the issue of the schools was on the agenda, as well as the question of how should we deal with the question of church governance. So here it gets very complicated. And we really have to stress again, though, that there was no call for that we want to self-impose segregation. But there was a widespread realization, not unanimity, but widespread realization among the Black ministers that this was the only solution that would work. And so at the meeting, Elder McElhaney starts it off. I'm tempted to digress into all kind of details, but let me try to get to the most important point. But on the day that the main item comes up, Elder McElhaney is ill. He's in his sickbed. And Elder Peters went to him and said, Elder McElhaney, you have to come down here and you have to open the door. Because remember, 13 years before, 14 years before, 1930, don't even talk about them. Elder McElhaney, please, only you as General Conference President can at least put it on the table that it's a possibility. Do we maintain the status quo? Do we have separate conferences? Or do we do something else? And so that kind of focused the issue and then led to the vote to approve formation of separate Black conferences in those unions where there were sufficient numbers to do so.
This has been very enlightening. Thank you, gentlemen. We are pretty much out of time, so we're going to have to leave a number of items on the table. But there are a couple of things I want to ask about, and then we want to close by asking what you gentlemen are going to do next. But the story kind of typically ends with the vote. We vote, the General Conference votes to establish regional conferences. So then everybody goes home, and then there has to be there has to be a constituency. So what happens after the vote?
Mm-hmm. Well, then the Union Conference, as you said, has to set up a constituency meeting, and they have to set up how are we going to do this, which churches are going to be represented, and how many delegates can they send, and so forth. And so they did that first in the Lake region.
So what happened? That's the first. And I've been to zillions of constituency meetings, and they're not always fun, but the first constituency meeting, tell us about that.
Well, again, Jacob Justice in his book, Angels in Ebony, gives us just an interesting picture, and he was there. He was an eyewitness observer. And I think you need to read it or read Change Agents to get the details. But it ended with the election of Elder Dason, a veteran evangelist. But for some reason, not 100% clear, although I think we could make some educated guesses, that was not a particularly popular decision among the constituency. But it stood, the meeting kind of ended in a bit of dissension. And so there was a kind of a dramatic event there. And that may have, I don't know whether it influenced, I think there were other things that influenced the Columbia Union, though, to say, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure we actually want to do this. So there, for a few months there, it was hanging in the balance whether the Columbia Union would actually go ahead. And we had a whole other movement or revived phase of a lay movement based in Ohio that says we need to be included in this, number one, but then there was also talk that it might not happen at all. But by this time, the General Conference leaders saw this really needs to happen, and they kind of leaned on the Columbia Union brethren. And so in December at Ebenezer Church in Philadelphia, they had the constituency meeting that created what was then the Allegheny Conference. It was just all what is East and West were just one then until the 60s.
Imagine a constituency meeting where there's division. Now, who can imagine that? That's unimaginable. All right, close us out, Ms. Rebecca.
Thank you all so much for joining us. You all are researchers, so do you have any projects or research that you're really excited about that you would like to share with us?
I'm working on a book on Ellen G. White and Black people. Ellen G. White and Black people, as they say in church, pray saints. Pray saints. But this book, I believe, is going to be a blessing. I want to just touch on something that Doug said about the 1943 committee, and that is that how you treat other people will be the acid test of the judgment. This is what Matthew 25 says, right? You did it unto the least of these, you did it unto me. And this is one point that Ellen White, a co-founder and prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, she is hammering home to Seventh-day Adventists. Please Google Counsels on Black People by Ellen White, and you can download a compilation that I put together, 1,500 pages of what Ellen G. White said about Black people. You can download that now, it's free. But she constantly emphasized to white Seventh-day Adventists that how you treat Black people determines your Christianity. It determines your Adventism. That's what she says. She says you cannot just neglect, going south and event. This is shortly after emancipation. You cannot just neglect going south to evangelize Black people, to give them the gospel, to educate them, and expect that you will slip past or have a positive outcome in the final judgment. So that's what I'm working on now.
Let me just briefly say something about what I have been doing and sort of coming to the final phase of, but it's a project that Dr. Baker helped launch from the General Conference called the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists. Just put in Adventist Encyclopedia, ESDA, Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists. It's not yet fully complete, but between Dr. Baker, myself, DeWitt Williams, and many other authors, we really have tried to give good coverage to Black Adventists. So many of the people that we've been talking about, if you want to find out more, go to the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists.
Black Adventists and women.
Yes.
I was the inaugural managing editor, and if you look at the previous encyclopedias, the last one was in 1996, they would leave out women. So you would have a missionary couple, let's say they were in Papua New Guinea, and they would only have the man's name in there. And in fact, it used to take us, work at the General Conference archives, it would sometimes take 3 or 4 hours to find the name of the man's wife. Because it would say, let's say he was a Mr. Smith or Pastor Smith. Even in her obituary, it would say Mrs. Pastor Smith. It wouldn't even list her name. And so we spent all that time finding the women because it's essential, because it's necessary. And so not only does the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists, once again, please Google it, not only do we highlight Black people across the diaspora. In Africa, we had 3 regional offices in Africa. So these are Africans producing their own articles on African Adventists. Once again, something that did not happen in the 1996 encyclopedia. So I would encourage you all to go to the website and support it.
All right. We want to thank Doctors Baker and Morgan for their passion, for their information, and we have been blessed by their presentation. So gentlemen, we thank you. We want to thank Pastor Smith-Reid and the Washington First Church for being good hosts and allowing us to return to the place 80 years later where a lot of this started. So we thank you for that. We thank you. We thank our producer out on the West Coast, Pastor Barone Savore. We thank Pastor John Boston in Chicago and his members for helping us to tell this story. One of the greatest threats to our future is our forgetting what God has done in the past. This morning I talked about how the Allegheny Conference started in the back room of Elder Dotson's bookstore. We didn't even have our own office, and his desk was a sink with a board over it. Look how far God has brought us. Ms. Jackson, close us out with prayer, please.
Let us pray. Dear loving Lord and Father, how comforting it is to know that we are important to you. We thank you so much for the great efforts that you go through to save us collectively and us as individuals. Please be with us that we may witness to others and have that same passion to draw all men unto Christ. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen. We want to thank our audience for being with us from the historic First Seventh-day Adventist Church in Washington, D.C. I'm Elder Edmond. For Elder Pancorbo and Ms. Jackson, thank you for joining us, and good night.
First Sabbath Series. Discover the stories. Explore the legacy. Be part of the conversation. Your hosts, Dana C. Edmond, Rebecca Jackson, and Jerson Pancorbo. This month, we will talk with pastors and historians of the church about the creation of the regional conferences. First Sabbath Series, 80th Anniversary of Regional Conferences.